Welcome back for another episode of Leadership that Liberates. Today, I really want to dive into the topic of identity. There is so much to explore and uncover with this concept, and it is something that plays a big role in the work that I do one-on-one with people, but it's also something that was very significant in the research I did around religious and national identity and the role that identity plays in cross-cultural conflict and in civil and international war. Though identity can very often be this source of pride for us, or maybe belonging or worthiness, it can, in many ways, both on an individual and collective level, be problematic. Because from the ways that I work with identity and that I see identity coming into the complexities of our lived experience, I do think it is a big driver for the disconnection within us and the division between us. And so I want to explore that a little bit. And, identity is really, it's the ways in which we define ourselves in a sense. And there are typically three types of identity that we can talk about. Firstly, there's personal identities. And these are the ways we really define our sense of self. It relates to our self-concept, our sense of worthiness, our self-esteem. And so examples of personal identity markers, it's the ways that we label ourselves. I'm hardworking versus I'm lazy. I'm creative or I'm rational, I'm logical. I'm sensitive, I'm ambitious and direct. These kinds of different ways that we identify the ways that we show up in the world, our quote unquote personality. And then there are social identities, and these identities are more related to the roles that we play in our lives and in our relationships. Examples of social identities could be I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, someone is a coworker of someone else, you're someone's colleague, you are the goalkeeper on a soccer team, right? Like these are kind of your roles within a social context. And then we have our cultural identities, and these are often our markers of belonging. And so these refer to identities related to our nationality, to our ethnicity, to our religious affiliation, to our gender self-perception, our gender identity, self-expression. These are all cultural identities. So again, our personal identities are very much related to our self-concept, our self-worth, our self-esteem, as are the social and cultural. But it's like the personal identities are more a reflection of the ways in which we've internalized the expectations around the social and cultural identities. So it's really through the expectations of social and cultural identities that we derive a sense of belonging and a sense of self in relation to everyone and everything else. Those communities, let's say, that are associated with our social and cultural identities shape the judgments we have around our personal identities. There's a different quality or texture to have an identity of someone who is hardworking and ambitious versus someone who is lazy, unmotivated, and not driven, because there are cultural connotations for what it means to show up in the world in those two ways. So there are attachments of kind of value or worth that become derived from those personal identities based on the context of the social and cultural identities that we hold. And identity, really, in its origin, refers to sameness, identical. So when we're talking about identity, in that sense, of course, now the meaning of it has evolved, but really the association and connotation with that sameness still carries forward in the consequences of the identities that we hold. So it is not that I sometimes express laziness or I sometimes am holding this kind of quality of laziness, but it's who I am, right? This is what identity does. It conflates a person's expression and a person's orientation to relationships in the world with who they are. The two become synonymous so that I am my identities. They're not just something I have, something I hold, a part of me, an element of expression, something that I do. They are who I am. And this is often why shame can become synonymous with the identities that we hold. That conflation, in many ways, removes our sense of agency or choice. That can very much happen with identity because we are putting ourselves in a box by identifying with a certain quality, with a certain community, with a certain set of expectations. I really think that in the process of our identity formation, as we're growing up, this is a big part of the reason why parts of us become cast into the shadow, because there is a certain way in which we expected to perform our identity. And when who we are becomes synonymous with the identities we hold, we are then beholden to the expectations attached to those identities. So we have to show up in a very particular way in order to be a good whatever the identity is. A good student, a good daughter, a good Greek, a good Christian, a good Muslim. What does it mean to perform these identities? And how is that actually creating limitation in our own sense of self and how we show up in the world? But then also, how is it creating and propagating separation and division between people? It's very different for me to say, I have anxiety or I experience anxiety. That is so different to I am anxious. I am an anxious person. There's a different quality, a different texture, a different energy to that way of relating to anxiety. I have or I experience anxiety versus I am anxious. I have now become identified with that thing. So I am that thing, and that thing is me. We are synonymous. And when we are identified with something in that way, it becomes much harder to break away from it, to detach from it, to disentangle ourselves from the connotations of what it means to be an anxious person. I experience depression versus I am depressed. Different quality, different texture again. And we can look at the process of identity formation on the individual level, really being rooted in a set of beliefs. So what happens is we have some kind of experience. This is more so around our personal identities, but we have some kind of experience that leads to some sort of belief that we internalize as a result of that experience. That belief that we internalize then becomes expressed or displayed through a set of behaviors that we take on that reflect that belief. Those set of behaviors create a set of results. They lead to some sort of consequences in our lives. And those results and those consequences offer us some sort of evidence that the belief we've been holding on to is true. And the more that that cycle becomes reinforced, the belief becomes an identity. And this is how we kind of get stuck or trapped. This also, I think, plays a big role in the cycles or the loops that we find ourselves in, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I have some kind of experience where I am, I'm often misunderstood by people, I might develop some kind of belief that people don't like me or that people don't want me around. That belief is then going to shape my behavior. So I may become avoidant of social interaction. I may withdraw or isolate in social settings. And then I'm making people around me feel kind of uncomfortable or take on the assumption that I don't want to be engaged socially. And so they're going to slowly stop engaging with me. Now I'm seeing the results of my belief in play. Oh, people aren't really talking to me. People aren't really trying to get to know me. Though they're responding to my behavior, but their response for me serves as some kind of evidence that my belief is true. I start to form some kind of identity around this experience of being misunderstood or being outcast or being unwanted, being rejected. This becomes part of who I believe myself to be. It is part of my sense of self. There's this one activity that I used to use a lot back when I was an intercultural educator, and I think it can be really useful and helpful in the context of personal growth and development and creating more awareness, self-awareness. And it is called the ABC exercise. Record your ABCs. So the A in ABC is the activating event. There's some event experience that we have at some point in our lives, in most cases, something that happens early on in our lives. And that activating event leads to some kind of belief. So the belief is the B. What are the beliefs that I have internalized as a result of this activating event? And then the C of the ABCs are the consequences. What are then the consequences of me holding this belief? And if we look back at this a loop of identity formation, there are some kind of results that I'm experiencing, these consequences I'm experiencing as a result of the behavior associated with the belief. And this is reinforcing some kind of identity. So that's just something that if you wanted to think about that, what is an event that had a significant impact on you? And what are the beliefs that you have internalized about yourself and the world around you, and or how the world relates to you or how you relate to the world as a result of this event, this situation, this experience? And how are those beliefs that you took on from that experience shaping the way you show up and interact in the world? And how is that leading to some aspect of who you believe yourself to be, of this identity that you've taken on? Now, this is one of the reasons that we can get almost like boxed or trapped in by these identities, because when identity becomes something static, something fixed, versus something fluid and, you know, evolving, then it's like we cannot really reconcile with experiences that challenge our sense of identity, because to let go of some aspect of identity feels threatening to our sense of self, because it is who I am. So if I let go of that, who am I without that part of me? This is part of why people have identity crises, because identity is something that we cling to, that we need to hold on to, because we believe who we are to be synonymous with this aspect or element of our identity. And this is also, of course, why the process of personal growth and evolution can bring up a sense of loss or a sense of grief for us. Because very often we have to let go of who we have believed ourselves to be in order to become and lean into the truth of who we really are. And our identity is very often a reflection of either who we believe we're supposed to be, or somehow a reflection of how we have failed to live up to the expectation of who we were supposed to be. Another challenge here is that these fixed and static definitions of identity then create a lot of cognitive dissonance and discomfort for us when it comes to the complexity of intersectionality, of intersecting identities. So if I have two identities that are conflicting or competing with each other in terms of expectations, say that, for example, I identify as queer, but I also identify as Christian, there is almost like an inherent incompatibility with those identities. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, of course, depending on the religious tradition that you're coming from or the way that you have learned to view your queerness in the context of your Christianity. It depends on all of that. But for the most part, there's going to be some kind of sense that the two don't fit together or don't work together. And of course, it makes sense that somebody who grows up in a very religious context is probably going to be a lot more fearful and apprehensive about being open and honest about the queer aspect of their identity because of the expectations in the group context. And if the group context is where I gain my sense of belonging and being part of something bigger than just myself, some kind of community, then this other aspect of my identity is going to feel threatening to this aspect of belonging. So when we have different identities that conflict with one another, then obviously, of course, we're going to experience some kind of inner conflict around that, which is usually going to be very distressful for us. That dissonance will create distress. And this is another reason why I think shadow work is so important, because shadow work is inviting us to bring all the parts of us together into harmonious relationship. Now, if we start to think about the way that this is playing out or showing up in the context of the collective, of group identity, we have something called social identity theory, which really talks about the ways in which we favor a particular group because we positively identify with it. And because we favor a group, we will allocate more resources to that group, in the sense that we will invest more time, more energy, more effort, more intentionality into our belonging within that group and our favoring of that group. And the more that we do that, the more that we almost go through this process of defining the value and importance of our in-group in opposition to outside groups. So this process, according to social identity theory, is happening kind of in three stages. The first stage is social categorization. So we start to categorize ourselves and others in relation to this favored group. You're either in the group, part of the group, or you're outside of the group. The second stage is social identification, where we begin to identify with that particular group, where we're investing into that group. And we will likely modify or change our behavior to some extent in order to ensure that we are part of that in-group, that we are favored by the group that we favor, to ensure that we maintain our membership or our belonging in the context of that group. The third stage then is social comparison. So now we are almost creating a sense of identity based on this group in opposition to people who are not part of this group, to groups who are outside of this in-group. So now we are emphasizing the similarities or the commonalities within groups, and we are emphasizing the difference or the disconnect between groups. So then it is us versus them. Christians are not the same as Muslims. Democrats are not the same as Republicans. We create these oppositions. And this is a way in which this kind of disconnection within us is reflected in the divisions between us. When I did my research on religious and national identity, one of the academics whose work I looked at quite a bit, he talked about the process of nation formation and how it happens very similar to the process of personal identity formation. In the same way that we create an individual identity, we create a national identity, which entails some process of differentiation so that I understand who I am by understanding who I am not. And oftentimes I am doing that by comparing and contrasting myself to something outside of me. And the process of creating a national identity happens in the same way. So both individuals and nations come to know who and what they are by first identifying who and what they are not. And of course, a lot of my research on this, in terms of collective and intergroup conflict, I was very focused on specifically the relationship between Greece and Turkey, which was the result of the Ottoman Empire, which applied to a whole region, a whole lot of different groups. So, something that was interesting is that within the Ottoman Empire, there was something called a millet system. And millets were religious communities. And so groups were kind of divided by religion, by these millets. And many academics and scholars believe that it was for this reason that after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the nationalist projects in regions like the Balkans centered around religion as a source and marker of identity. When you had the situation that happened in the Balkans in the early 90s, the groups were in conflict over religious identity because it was religious identity that they held onto as a source of identity during the Ottoman occupation. People didn't ever actually create some kind of unified Ottoman identity because they were separated by these religious groups. And these religious groups became the foundation or the basis upon which national identity was later constructed. So that again, groups were defining themselves in opposition to differing identities. Then we can look at a situation like kind of same time frame, the genocide in Rwanda, where almost 1 million people were killed in the span of 100 days. And this was on the basis of ethnicity. So it was the Tutsi ethnicity in particular that was being targeted in this genocide. One of the things that Rwanda did post-genocide in its reconciliation efforts and its efforts to create some kind of unity was they created a policy by which there was no longer this focus on ethnic difference. The government emphasized a collective Rwandan identity over these ethnic identities of Hutu or Tutsi or whatever other groups were in the region. And the idea was that there would be some kind of solidarity in people identifying as Rwandan rather than identifying with their tribe or their ethnic group. I believe that our attachments to identity are really an attachment to our ego. And when I talk about ego, I am not talking about arrogance or entitlement. I am talking about our self-protective mechanism. The ego is a gatekeeper. The ego is designed to protect us. The ego is designed to ensure that we do have some sense of worthiness or that we do experience some sense of belonging. And so really our attachments to our identities is an attachment to the part of us that really desires to be seen and validated and accepted. But it also, in many ways, can create limitation for us on the individual level and can create division for us on the collective level. Holding on to some aspects of identity, they really are a way by which we define our sense of self and belonging in the world. And I think they are also a way by which we remain disconnected from the true essence of who we really are. And we remain divided between us across identities. And so, what would it mean to actually not identify with our identities? It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to banish or deny any sense of identity or some aspects of identity. But I think it's important for us to ask ourselves when and how and to what extent are the identities I hold creating limitations and reinforcing divisions. So, like, for example, I have a lot of pride in my Greek identity, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that, probably because there's some nostalgia associated with it, because I grew up away from Greece, probably because there is some aspect of the culture that just like resonates with my soul. I listen to the music and I weep because I just feel it in my bones. I can't even explain, like I'm literally, I feel emotional right now talking about it. There is something for me that is so meaningful about being Greek. Now, if that aspect of my identity were to be weaponized somehow, if that pride I have about being Greek were to be about wanting to somehow dehumanize or oppress someone who is not Greek, then it becomes problematic. I don't ever feel that way because of my Greekness, but some people might. Some people probably do, right? And of course, I know from my research historically that has been the case. Or if I look at a more personal kind of example, kind of related to the episode that I shared last week, something that I identify with in some way is being empathetic. I really do see myself as an empathetic person. And I think in many cases, my empathy was a response to abuse because I had to empathize with my abuser to remain safe, to maintain some aspect of safety. And I think there are a lot of different things that play into my ability to empathize. It isn't just that. But then what happens that kind of teeters on the edge of danger is that I do have a lot of empathy toward abusers. That can be good to an extent, and it can be problematic. It can put me in danger. It can put other people in danger if I don't know where to draw the line with my capacity to empathize and with my ability to actually see and acknowledge harm. Or let's say a more kind of quote unquote negative aspect of identity I might have is the example that I shared around being misunderstood and then withdrawing and then leading to these beliefs around rejection. That is a reflection of my own personal experience. And so, kind of an identity that I maybe unconsciously held for much of my life is that I was a victim, that I was rejected, that I was unwanted. And again, there are many layers to that. There are a lot of different things that play into that. But if I identify myself as someone who is unwanted, that is very much going to shape and define how I show up in the world. That is going to impact my lived experience in a way that will lead to isolation, seclusion, loneliness, depression, sadness, or I could choose to see things in a different way. And again, this is like where that aspect of self accountability and responsibility comes in. It is my choice how I engage with the world. I can choose to see myself as unwanted and rejected. And sure, I am for sure going to have experiences where people don't really like me. I mean, that's inevitable. But if I define my sense of self and my sense of worth on that, I'm going to be pretty miserable in life. There are ways in which we need to really examine how useful our identities are and are they really serving us? And at what point do they become self-damaging or detrimental to connection and to shared understanding between groups? There are ways in which identities can serve us, but there are ways in which they oftentimes really don't. And because of our propensity to cling to our identities, to become attached to them, that's where sometimes it's not always easy for us to see the ways in which they actually are not serving us, but they are perpetuating problems. Wow, I just thought about this. I have a workbook that I created many, many years ago. If I remember correctly, it was more focused on cultural identity, but basically it takes you through this process of reflecting on the different identities that you hold and the different ways that they play a role in kind of creating your experience of life. And so maybe I will share that in the show notes if you're curious to kind of look through it and work through it. I will just leave you with this invitation to really consider what are the identities that you hold and in what ways are they shaping your sense of self and your relationship to the world and the ways in which you are maybe, sometimes perpetuating this kind of divisiveness based on the groups that you identify with and how they differ from groups that you maybe don't identify with. And are there perhaps identities that you might need to let go of in service of your own self sovereignty and your ability to be a happy human? And identities you might need to create a little bit more flexibility around in terms of creating a more empathetic and compassionate world where we are less divided among difference and more united around our shared humanity.